Right. A very good evening to all and welcome to the Smart Talk. This is a second session of the second um, group of Smart Talks. And we would like to welcome Dr. Pavanindran Lal, who is going to be introducing us and giving the opening remarks for this session.
Very good evening to all of you. And at the outset, I would like to congratulate the AWR surgeons community for organizing this smart talk and choosing a very apt topic, how to assess a published scientific paper. This is a topic which is often encountered by our residents, and they bring in papers which are either original articles or reviews, and they struggle with the interpretation of the message that is contained in those articles. And there are so many nuances of the way in which the article is written, starting from the type of journal that is there, what is the citation index of that, what is the credibility of the authors and the department from where that is coming, and the type of work that is being cited, whether there are conflicts of interest in the forms of support given from companies where the data is being generated, which sometimes is pushes the interpretation one side or the other. And then there are complicated statistics behind so many papers that average resident or the trainee surgeon, or even practicing all of us at some times, may not be able to get into the nitty-gritty of the article. And I think I would like to congratulate Dr. Sudeep Shah for coming on to explain to all of us and the viewership today about the critical aspects of the interpretation of messages contained within such scientific journals, and make a credible value out of it based on certain set principles. So I'm sure all of these are going to come out in the talk, and I really thank the organizing team, and would like to now and thank you for this opportunity for giving these opening remarks on behalf of my department in Maulana Azad Medical College, and also as the director of the National Board of Examinations. I would like to thank Dr. Jignesh Gandhi and Dr. Rajesh Srivastav, and hand over the proceedings to them as the moderators for this session. And really look forward to listening to Dr. Sudeep Shah, because every time when you are listening, you're always learning, and at no time that you stop learning. So I think it will be a great experience, and thank you once again for this opportunity. Over to Dr. Jignesh and Dr. Rajesh Srivastav, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for those kind opening remarks. And with me is my co-moderator, Dr. Rajesh Srivastav, who is a senior surgeon laparoscopic in Vapi. Sudeep, I have been associated with him for a fairly good number of years, and it is my fortune that he is an alumni from St. G.S. Medical College. Dr. Sudeep is an established liver transplant and HPB surgeon at PD Hinduja Hospital in Mumbai. And it's always a pleasure to listen to him, because he's very crisp, up to the point. And on numerous occasions, we have interacted, even socially and on, educational forums. So we would be very happy to hear from him. Dr. Rajesh, you want to make any opening remarks, and then hand over to Dr. Sudeep.
Thank you, sir. It is a pleasure for me to be a co-moderator with you, and of course, listening the talk of Dr. Sudeep Shah. I will not waste much more time, and I will request Dr. Sudeep Shah to please proceed. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'll start my screen share. Please confirm that you are able to see the PowerPoint here.
Yes, we can see the slides, Dr. Sudeep. We can start. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jignesh and Rajesh, for organizing this. This topic can go on for 3 days. It can take a long period of time. And I understand that I'm talking to my peers, my seniors. So I'll just stick to basic points as far as this goes, so that we don't get into a nitty-gritty of an individual paper, because the initial thought that was actually suggested by Jignesh was that I take up something relevant to AWR, I dissect it out. But what I realize is that when I do that in a forum, often the basic message of the principles of how to do this is lost. And everyone concentrates on the message of the paper. And there are many intrinsic biases which all of us have. And all these biases often color and hide the basic way that we should be scientifically studying the paper. So I'll just start by saying that why is this topic actually important? That we as a medical profession are very gullible. There have been so many Zoom meetings in the past few months. We listen to everybody. We tend to listen and believe a lot of what is told to us without really inquiring into the nitty-gritty of all this. And all sorts of information is given to us, and we tend to swallow that. The pharma industry is very strong, and they spend millions of dollars in actually selling us what appears to be a very, very strong message. And often things are being projected to us which are not really the absolute truth. And it's not just the overt marketing that they'll take you on a holiday somewhere and they'll have a symposium with 3 speakers. They will also pay for medical writers to write articles in the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, so that all the information that you get in that article is put in the best possible way forward, so that the flaws are all hidden and only the good stuff stays out. So there is a lot of pharma industry involvement in this. We know that there's an evolving role of evidence-based medicine. This has always been an interesting issue. It's been a bone of contention, how much EBM, how much not EBM. I'll just touch upon this. And it's always fun to criticize hard work done by other people. So we should be critical of papers that they really write. But more importantly, if we are able to criticize published papers, it gives us insights into our own efforts. And we have such a treasure trove of data in India that we can actually put forward as published literature. So if we can appropriately criticize other people's published work, then we know how to improve our own work. So when we publish, we actually bring the best paper forward. Now, the next question that residents often ask me is that why read research papers at all? You have textbooks, you have Harrison's and Sabiston, and everything is there. If you're looking at recent advances, you have all these clinics and surgical clinics which are available to you. You can always pick up your phone, abstracts available on the internet. And lastly, a medrep is visiting you in your OPD, and you have a whole host of people coming with very fancy charts who are telling you what can actually be done. But I think the best example of why we really need to read is the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that we are in. And I will be giving examples essentially from all the literature which has been generated in this, because none of us are biased, because all of us are ignorant about this disease. We never met the disease, before last year. We have no idea what really works and what doesn't work. And all of us are looking at the published literature, the abstracts on the internet, with the same level of knowledge and ignorance. And none of us are in any way prejudiced for or against anything, because we have really no idea and we are surgeons. So I think that this is something where the bias from the subject will not overcome the basic messages and methodological weaknesses of all the papers which have been presented. So when you look at what we've been faced through over the last year, we realize that neither Harrison nor recent advances will actually help you. Abstracts on the internet have been often very misleading, and a lot of pharma companies have pushed drugs forward which have been found not to work in the long term. So this is a classic reason why we should actually think about how we are reading research papers and what is the message we need to take out of them. So I've just put this up to show you how things have changed. So I've just taken a random year. This is 1954. And as you can see, you'll find sympathectomy from atherosclerosis, preliminary test, clinical outcome in general paralysis of the insane, survey of 76 consecutive cases, review of 100 consecutive cases. So this is the way we wrote thesis when we were students. This is the way literature was published, half a decade ago. Often there were single authors, full life's work would be reflected in this paper. very beautifully written, excellent English, very poetic, their life's experience, how they struggled, and finally they found what they thought was the best solution. And then they try and tell you that this is the right thing to do. Today, what we are faced with, and this is, 50 years down the line, meta-analysis, randomized controlled phase 3 trial, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, DUET-2 study group, Titan study group, DUET-1 study group, hundreds of authors, all putting together publications like this. So the whole language and grammar of what we are presented in the era of evidence-based medicine is completely different. And it is important for us to understand some of these terminologies so that we appreciate the benefits. And not only appreciate the benefits, we also appreciate the flaws of some of these methodologies so we can read these papers better and put this into our practice. So coming to that, how good is this evidence-based medicine anyways? So this is a definition by a lady called Trisha Greenhalgh. She is a professor of medicine at Oxford. She's the editor of the BMJ. And she has defined EBM as the use of mathematical estimates of the risk of benefit or harm. So that means there's a number involved which tells you whether there's a risk of harm or whether there's actually benefit. It's derived from high quality research, right, on population samples, and it informs on clinical decision making in an individual patient. So you're taking all these mathematical estimates that you got from your high quality research in your published paper, which has been done from samples of a population, and you're trying to translate that to inform on the decision you're making in that patient sitting in front of you in the OPD. So therefore, you have to see that the population is suitable, whether the numbers match, and whether the quality is good enough for you to use these numbers to inform on your individual decision making. So with this as a background, I would just like to go through the various points that you need to look into when reading the paper. Now, the most important question that would be faced to anybody is, what is the question that the paper is trying to answer? Often we try and generalize the answer of the paper to something like, yes, this is effective in this disease. For example, the Minister of Health will stand up and say that Coronil is effective in COVID. But what is the question, the paper that Baba Ramdev ji published? The question in that paper is that by using the Ayurvedic preparation in patients of COVID who have mild or no symptoms, what happens to the positivity of the PCR test on day 3? So this is a very different question to saying that COVID is cured and everyone becomes better. So once we understand what is the precise question that the paper is trying to answer, then we know what is the answer we are getting at the end. Now, that answer may not be valuable to us. My personal viewpoint might be that if the patient is asymptomatic to start off with, I'm really not interested in whether the PCR is positive or negative, and I may stop reading the paper at that point. On the other hand, if I am a traveler and I want to travel to another place and I have to do a COVID swab and I want that PCR to reflect negative, then I might want to put the Ayurvedic medicine up my nose, get a negative swab after 3 days, so that I'll be able to fly out to that destination. So that answer might be very useful to me. So depending on what is the precise question, you would like to see the answer and utilize the answer in your practice. So please search very carefully as to what is the precise question the paper is trying to answer. Usually you will find this at the end of the introduction when you are reading a published paper. Now, we all know that we follow the IMRAD format. So you have the introduction, methods, results, and the discussion. So the introduction should answer the so what, who cares question. It should tell you what is known about the illness. It should tell you what are the lacunae which the paper aims to address. At the bottom of this, the last paragraph is typically where this question is answered. So it is usually in the form of a null hypothesis. So this is actually the reverse of the hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is, yes, the drug works in this population, your null hypothesis is that we are disproving the hypothesis that this drug does not work. And that is what your statistics are based on. So we hypothesize that giving remdesivir in this dose in patients with severe COVID will improve the duration of hospital stay in this group of patients, would be your hypothesis. Your null hypothesis is that we feel that there will be no difference in the hospital stay of patients with COVID with remdesivir, and we disprove this and thereby say that the drug is effective. So this would be the hypothesis and the null hypothesis. It's a very important concept to understand. And once we understand this hypothesis or the null hypothesis, then we will very clearly understand what is the question that the paper is trying to answer. The next part is the methodology. Now, there are very many different methods that can be used. So you have an experimental design where you're actually, intervening in a strong way. You're doing a clinical trial where you might be giving drug A to a person, drug B to another group, or you might be having a placebo. You might just be doing a survey of a group of patients. I'll go through some of these in detail a little later on. You might be reviewing what other people have already done in their study. So you might have systematic reviews, you'd have meta-analysis where the statistics have been added together. You have society guidelines. So the AWR Society might bring out its guidelines. So all of you will sit together, go through the available literature. You might have different analysis. So you have analysis on the decision making. So how do you manage a complex hernia or a defect? You might have an economic analysis. Is the treatment cheaper? Is this treatment more expensive? So therefore, you have many, many different types of methods. And what is most important is, once you understood the question, does this method appropriately tackle the question? So if you set out to show that there is a survival advantage in drug A within your population, if you find out there's no survival advantage, and incidentally, by analyzing all the parameters, you found out that the population has a lesser incidence of headache, you cannot then repurpose this paper to say that headache is reduced by drug A, because the question that you have posed is based on a survival curve and not on the incidence of headache. Similarly, you cannot say that this method is cheaper, this method is easier, unless you have built this into your clinical or your research question. If your research question is this a cheaper way to do A than B, then you're perfectly justified in concluding, yes, it is cheaper. If that is a side effect, just something that you found out at the end by analyzing the data, then you can mention it in the discussion, but your whole paper cannot be based on the concept that, yes, we have a cost benefit, because that is not the question which you set out to answer. And your study was therefore not designed just to look at that as the primary point. Now I'll just move on to the different types of studies that we face. So we have randomized controlled trials. Now this is called as level 1 evidence. Everyone loves randomized controlled trials. And the reason for that is that it is probably the best way to generate evidence. In this, because you have randomly allocated patients to two groups, the only difference between the two groups will be the single variable that you're testing, which is the intervention that you're giving one group and not giving the other group. You're essentially trying to cancel out all the other confounding factors by your randomization. So you're testing a single variable. You're evaluating a specific null hypothesis which you have generated, saying there's no difference, and you're trying to overturn it. It has to be prospective because you're randomizing patients. You obviously cannot randomize them backwards. Because you have a control arm, all your biases should theoretically be less. This word bias is very important because this is what either willingly or unwillingly comes in to all our data and takes away from the truth. Bias is a very, very important concept for us to understand. It's not that any of us bring in bias always as a method of fraud or corruption or something which comes in on purpose. Often it creeps in because we as doctors are passionate about our patients. We have certain preconceptions. Now, unfortunately, the preconception may not agree with the truth. The truth is an absolute. The truth will come out with time. And as long as we accurately collect data in all these studies, making sure we minimize bias, we will land up with the truth. So even if you go through all the published papers in the past, and I will give you examples of those later on, you will find that in some of them, the truth is hidden within the paper, except that people have not read it because the data is accurately collected, but the writers had a bias and they sidelined it. And the advantage of doing it in this fashion is that if you have many such randomized control trials looking at the single variable, you can actually add them together. So if the sample size is small and you've really not got significance in a group of patients, this allows you something called a meta-analysis. But where can you be fooled? The first point is you can have too few patients. So therefore, you don't have the power in your study to actually differentiate between the two groups and to show that enough people actually met the endpoint that you want. On the other hand, you can have too many patients. So you can do a study with 20,000 patients. You can find a 0.1% difference. That can be significant statistically. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is this statistical difference also a clinical difference? Does that 0.1% matter to my patient? Is it worth taking all the trouble and the effort and the cost and the suffering to give that 0.1% extra to actually help the patient? Because will it really make a difference? We must understand the funding issue, that there is always an agenda behind all this. So all the facts may not actually be revealed to us. And there is an issue with the endpoint, which I will come to next. And it all comes down to biases. There may be biases of randomization. At this time, we have met studies where randomization has supposed to have been taken place, but we don't know how that has actually happened. You can actually break certain codes. You can predict where the next patient is going. We may fail to include all the eligible patients. So you are so super selective in your population that it is really not going to be applicable to practice. And everything may not be as blind as it seems. And I can give you a classic historical example of this. So in the UK, they had planned a very interesting study for very simple intervention. So you had patients with stroke, and the MRC wanted to see whether putting DVT stockings, which is a very simple application, will prevent deep vein thrombosis in patients with stroke. So very laudable study, very simple intervention. They had the envelopes and they randomized. At the end of it, they realized that when they broke the randomization, the ones without DVT stockings all had more severe stroke than the ones with the DVT stockings. Now, they inquired into how this happened. Then they realized that the nurses were the ones who were actually putting the stockings. All these patients with stroke who had severe stroke were incontinent. So they would pass stool, they'd pass urine, the stockings would get dirty. So the nurse had to wash these stockings, change these stockings regularly. So what the nurse would do was take the randomization envelopes up to the light. The paper wasn't quite opaque. They would read through that. And then they would discourage patients from coming on to the trial if the patient had a severe stroke and were randomized to the stocking arm. So this entire massive MRC trial collapsed because nurses didn't want to wash stockings and could read through the envelope, which is why you get the sealed opaque envelope statement, which all of you must have read when you read publications. Today, you have computerized randomization. or in large multi-center studies, you just have to pick up a phone call, make a phone call, and they will tell you where the patient will be randomized, and that takes away all the bias. When you're presenting a randomized control trial, you're supposed to use what is called the consort statement. So this consort group has got together and told you everything that you need to include when you are presenting a randomized control trial for publication. So it's got many points. It's a checklist and you just tick them all off. So you're very transparent about where you're excluding patients and showing in each arm those allocated to the intervention. So even after randomization, you have not discouraged patients to be in a particular arm, whether the loss to follow-up are different, the reason why interventions have been discontinued, have all to be put in so that you can see that at no stage are you biasing your trial by excluding patients on your own to make sure that the more difficult patient, the more complicated patient is not removed from any arm, and the numbers stay balanced and fairness is maintained. So just to put up the 26 different types of bias, I've just put up 4 of these. The selection bias I've just alluded to with the sealed opaque envelopes. You can have a performance bias. So if I wanted to do a study tomorrow to prove that the latest type of hernia repair is better than a good old-fashioned standard of care, it's very simple. The professor and head of department will do the latest repair. The first post houseman will do the old-fashioned repair. A hernia repair is a simple thing. You should be able to do it. But then we all know what the outcomes will be at the end of the study, for the simple reason that an inexperienced surgeon has done one arm while the professor has done the other arm. This will be very difficult to bring out in the methodology. So often for these performance-based studies, the reviewer will ask, what is the experience of the surgeons who have carried out the surgery? And if you're writing your paper well, you will say that all surgeons carrying out these procedures had a minimum prior experience of 50 cases before doing this study. Exclusion biases are possible for different withdrawals. So for example, if you're looking at a toxic drug or toxic chemotherapy, the patient might just decide to withdraw himself from the study because they've got toxicity. Now, this is very important information that you need to know about. So it's not that the patient has withdrawn on his own or just lost to follow up because he's not come back to OPD. He's withdrawn for the toxicity. So rather than say lost to follow up, the correct thing would be a withdrawal. And that is where you need to be very clear when you fill out the consort statement as to the exact reason why this exclusion has taken place, so that you don't have the young, fit people without less side effects all being analyzed in the intervention arm, while the control arm has all comers and will often do badly because they have, you know, the sick and the infirm who have actually been taken in because the treatment has not been offered to them. Then, of course, there's a detection bias in outcome measurement. And the classic that we face is when we are doing visual analog pain scores. So you can ask the patient a very simple thing. You can go to him and say, "Kitna darad hua?" He will tell you so much. Or you can say, "Darad nahi hota hai na?" And he wants to keep you happy. So he'll say, "No pain." So you'll put on the visual analog scale 0. While for the other patient, you will say, "Yes, darad hota hai. Jada darad hua na, painkiller abhi liya ki nahi?" So you say, "Haan, jada darad hua," and then you will put down 8. So the very way in which you are going to detect things can be biased in your outcome measurement. So this is something that you have to look for. The best way to prevent detection bias is that the observer who is recording these readings should not know which arm the patient has been randomized to, so that they will record each with equality. The classic example in this COVID era has been the favipiravir study, where you find out that the only parameter on which the drug wins is time to discharge. But this was not a blinded study, though it was placebo controlled. So the doctors knew whether the patients were getting favipiravir or not. So they were perfectly open to the bias of saying, "Yes, you are on a drug. I'm sending you home earlier." Or, "No, you're not on any drug. I'm just giving you paracetamol. Let me keep you for observation for 2 days more." So that bias will come in unless you have adequate blinding when you are looking at your study. And therefore, when you're either planning or evaluating a study, see how the evaluators were blinded and whether this bias would have been removed. So moving on to the other types of study. So we all know about cohort studies, where is the group of patients that we follow up over time, the case control studies. Case control studies are excellent for looking at causation and natural history. And the classic example, you heard this statement, a glass of wine a day is good for you. So all of us have heard this statement. So you can imagine how this study is done. So you knock on someone's door, and what the study actually shows you is something like this, where you have no alcohol consumption, there's a mortality. You drink a glass of wine or 2 glasses, mortality is lowest in that group. And then the mortality, of course, in the complete alcoholics really takes off. Now, how will this study be done? You knock on someone's door with a pro forma, a nice person will ask them, do you drink at all? They will say, yes, we drink. No, we don't drink. Then we see over a period of time how many of these die. And then you get this wonderful J-shaped curve. But imagine how it happens in real life. So you go, you knock on the door. The chappie said, no, I don't drink at all. But he's actually been an alcoholic all his life. He's been admitted with hepatorenal syndrome to hospital, just been discharged, stopped drinking 3 days back, too scared to tell you that he's been drinking, and he's going to die in the next 15 days. The next person whose door you knock on, cancer patient, been told that with chemotherapy cannot drink, not been drinking, but will die in the next 15 days of his tumor. So these confounding factors, which will actually interfere with your final conclusion, have to be looked at very carefully before you make any strong conclusions in these type of case control studies. The cross-sectional survey is often done as a DNB thesis. It's very good in real life because it tells you what's actually happening in your practice, in your hospital. And it tells you what is happening at a point in time. So it tells you about the prevalence of a disease, unlike a follow-up forward in time, which will tell you the incidence. So these are very good things to do and should not be discounted. But obviously, the cross-sectional survey will depend on the individual practice which is there in your department. A classic example of this is if you read a BJS paper by Professor Samiran Nandi on what are the causes of hematemesis in India. So he did a cross-sectional survey in his department, and he found out that the commonest cause of hematemesis in India is variceal bleed. Because if you had minor gastritis and hematemesis, you are handled in all the nursing homes in Delhi. But the moment they suspected variceal bleed, they packed you off to the All India Institute. So the moment you say that the study comes from the All India Institute, you get the bigger diagnosis. But this is real life for the All India Institute, but perhaps not real life for the population of India. So you must interpret the cross-sectional survey within the background of the population presenting to the department from which the paper actually comes in. Does the case report have value? Because we all start our initial writing careers, it helps our CV with the case report. And sometimes it can really point out a significant problem. So a lot of journals have removed case reports. I think that is very wrong. It still has value. And I put up this slide in almost all my talks. All of you recognize this thalidomide baby. So it was just this letter in the Lancet. 2 cases, thalidomide and congenital anomalies, 1 paragraph letter, Lancet 1961. And that's all it took to revolutionize the way drugs are looked at, to prevent tens of thousands more babies having this problem, and completely change the way pharmacological research has been done in the world since that. So the case report is significant. You can pick up a valuable tip, a valuable pointer, provided there is a unique selling point within the case report. Now, once you got the hang of the overall type of study, there's some important questions that you need to ask before you know whether I should read the paper further. Is the study original, or is it a Me Too study? So 10 people have already studied this, the 11th, this is the 12th, this is the 15th. Is there any new information? So the introduction should tell you the so what, who cares question is what is new in what the study is doing. So is it worth my time to read the complete paper? Who has been studied? Is the population relevant to my practice? And more importantly, who has been left out? So this is a very common question that is asked by your patient to you. So an 80-year-old will come and ask you, will the AstraZeneca vaccine work on me? But I can tell you that not many 80-year-olds were included when the AstraZeneca vaccine was studied. So countries like Germany put a question mark on whether 80-year-olds should be given the AstraZeneca vaccine. We know that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine has been separately studied in the geriatric population. So we know that there are specific populations where you're going to get different outcomes. Pediatric populations, populations with renal failure, populations with heart disease, the geriatric population. So it is very important to see who has been studied. So what works in very fit Chinese athletes may not work with the elderly grandmother coming in your OPD and sitting opposite you. So you have to be very clear between who has been studied and who has been left out. The endpoint is something that I would like to spend 5 minutes on. So the classic endpoints that we are actually interested are death and happiness. We want our patients to live longer and live happier. Now, death is a very clear endpoint. There's no arguing over that. But obviously, it is not valid for the vast majority of studies that we do. And I'm sure the AVR Society will never be doing studies where they're looking at death as an endpoint. That will never occur in any of their patients. So you want the patients to be happier with what you're doing. Now, happiness is obviously something which is impossible to measure. We know that in real life. So what we actually use are surrogate endpoints which reflect happiness, such as disease-free survival, pain-free survival, time stayed in hospital, return to work. All these are surrogate endpoints. Now, a surrogate endpoint should truly reflect the disease, change in proportion to severity, and be quantifiable and reproducible. A classic example of a surrogate endpoint is serum creatinine. So if you're looking at renal failure, it reflects disease because the higher the creatinine, the more is the renal failure. It will change in proportion to severity. So again, if the renal failure worsens from today to tomorrow, it will increase. It is quantifiable because you have a measurement, and it is reproducible. So if you have 3 reliable labs, you have the same blood sample, you send it to all 3 reliable labs, you will have the same quantification of renal dysfunction. Now, if I take the same serum creatinine and use it in a cirrhotic patient, I will find out that it really loses the first 2 points because creatinine comes as a breakdown protein of muscle metabolism. We are not interested in creatinine as a molecule in itself, but only as a marker. Cirrhotics have very poor muscle mass. They anyway produce less creatinine. So they might be having perfectly normal creatinine, but have a GFR of 30 or 20. So then it stops being as good a surrogate endpoint. So what is surrogate endpoint good for population A may not be good for endpoint B. Similarly, when we come to COVID, is it good enough to say my PCR became negative on the swab? Or is it good enough to say that my hospital stay was shorter? We don't really know because these endpoints may not truly reflect what is happening to the patient and the disease. Survival is an absolute endpoint. Need for ventilation is an absolute endpoint. SpO2 is an absolute endpoint because it is measurable and reproducible using a pulse oximeter, but the other endpoints may not actually be. Then we come to statistics. I'll just run through this because, statistics frighten all of us. You need to have enough patients. So there's something like a power calculation, which you will see in the statistical methodology. Important thing, especially in Indian studies, is length of follow-up. We often hide truly loss to follow-up. We are often embarrassed to say the patients didn't come back. There is no study in the world where everybody follows up over 10 years. That just cannot happen, however good your healthcare system is. Completeness to follow-up can be reflected and is very essential when you do analysis. Now, when we are doing analysis, there are 2 terms you will come across: intention to treat and per protocol. It is important to distinguish between these 2. Intention to treat means that the moment I randomize the patient, he goes to a given group. Whether he gets the treatment at all or not, he is treated as within that group. Now, if you look at that, this is what will happen in real life. You will plan to treat a patient. Some of them may not complete your treatments, follow all your tablets, come up for the treatment, may default, may not follow up at all with you. While a per protocol analysis, so if you finished doing the protocol, you'll be in the per protocol analysis. This is very important to see whether the intervention actually works. So a per protocol analysis will tell you whether the intervention is effective, and intention to treat analysis will tell you real life. So if your protocol is difficult, your protocol is hard, a lot of patients drop out from it, but you still want to know whether the protocol worked and whether you need to tweak it to take out the toxicity so more people will take it. The per protocol analysis will tell you, while the intention to treat won't. Now, I won't go through a lot of the statistical tests because most journals have a statistical reviewer. So don't bother too much about these things. So the Gaussian curves and such, these are all the names which you will come across, correlations, regressions. But I would like to focus a little bit on reporting the data. So you know that there are odds ratios and relative risks. The numbers actually will come out more with an odds ratio than with a relative risk. There is a concept of a 95% confidence interval. It's a very simple concept. So if I did my study millions of times, what range will the data come 95% of times if I repeated my study infinitely? Now I put up two things here. The hazard ratio is the same as a relative risk of 0.2, confidence interval 0.1, 0.7, hazard ratio 5, confidence interval 1.4 to 14.6. Now, as a surgeon, when I just look at it, I think this hazard ratio is innocuous. This hazard ratio is very dangerous because this is telling me something is 5 times as bad as this. But this is actually a real life situation. This is actually the same data. 5 is the inverse of 0.2. And this is a famous paper in the NEJM on a drug called rofecoxib. All of you are familiar with Vioxx. That was withdrawn because it caused myocardial infarcts in patients. And Merck lost billions of dollars on court cases after that. So in the first paper on GI toxicities, where they shown that it is very friendly for the gut, this data was there because truthfully they had reported that the hazard ratio for myocardial infarct was 0.2 for naproxen as compared to rofecoxib. But because this was just slipped into the text in one corner and the number looked innocuous, people didn't pay attention to it until 10 years later, they realized people are dying of heart attacks. While if they had written the hazard ratio was 5, rofecoxib to naproxen, I'm sure a lot of people would have woken up and all this disaster would have been prevented. So again, the number needed to treat is a very good number to look at. How many patients do you need to treat to benefit one patient? So if you look at tocilizumab with the recovery trial, you need to treat 25 seriously ill patients requiring oxygen with COVID, with tocilizumab to benefit one. So the number needed to treat is 25. So this is a very important piece of data to look at. Quickly on animal experiments, we know that mice are not men for the simple reason that all mice are genetically matching. Human beings don't have the advantage. They are brought up in a very controlled environment where their diet is controlled. They have to follow all the rules because they're in a cage. Human beings have the ability to eat vada pav and behave in the way they feel like, drink uncontrollably. So this interferes with experiments. Mice are always bumped off at a fixed period of time. So you might find out at 30 days, there is no renal toxicity. But human beings, we don't bump them off at the end of the study. So you might find out at the end of 5 years, as they did in the rofecoxib study, that heart attack has come to a lot of people with rofecoxib. And of course, they're metabolically different. So you'll find a lot of cancer treatments which have worked in mice, but really have not managed to work in men later on. Quickly about diagnostic text reporting, one must remember the Bayesian principle. So the classic example is CT chest for COVID. So you take 100 hypoxic patients in hospital with severe COVID, you do CT chest, you'll find out it's very sensitive, it's very specific, it's picking up all the illnesses. But if you take up asymptomatic patients coming for surgery, you're using CT chest to diagnose COVID in that, you will find out that those who have COPD, those who have cardiac failure, they'll give you false positives. You'll find that a lot of people who are COVID positive on the swab, who will develop symptoms and hypoxia 10 days later or 5 days later, will have a negative CT when they present it to you. So always look at the pre-test probability. and the population you're studying before you interpret the diagnostic test. And also look at the gold standard. What are you comparing it against? Often the gold standard is a silver standard. Did everyone take part? And again, are there inter-observer biases? Are there expectation biases of what your result will come at? The moment you're told the patient has COVID, are you going to report more COVID on the CT, or are you completely blinded to what these findings are? So make sure that there's no bias in diagnostic text reporting. I will not spend time on sponsorship and bias. I think the statement just says everything on its own. Remember to see sponsorship of studies, and more importantly, whether medical authors have been used to help the person write the paper. So you'll find a very famous and very big name as first author, but you will find at the end in the acknowledgement that medical author was used to help person X write the paper. So that will give you biases in covering up a lot of data. A quick word about meta-analysis. We know that there are a lot of discrepancies between meta-analysis and subsequent large RCTs. So you might have an inaccurate prediction in 35% of the time. So please do not take these meta-analysis on face value. Study the methodology of the meta-analysis in the same way that you will study a randomized control trial. The reason that meta-analysis may not be so good are because you cannot add apples and oranges. The populations may be different, the endpoints might be different, the time frames may be different. All outcomes may not be accurately reported, and there is a classic publication bias. So a positive study is more likely to be reported than a negative study. So your meta-analysis might be a whole addition of positive studies. Negative studies on the subject might have been completely ignored. There might be a search bias because people may want to say that the meta-analysis worked, so they have selectively ignored certain searches. And there's statistics. There's a separate talk on meta-analysis at any point. If you're interested, we can go into that. So the weightages can be adjusted to really skew your results. The good news is that most bad papers have been sorted out by the time you have actually reached the discussion. So by the time you look at the methods, the introduction, the clinical question, you know that this is garbage, I don't want to read further. The discussion helps explain unusual features of the study. So if you find there are odd points here, the authors will try and explain them in the discussion. What is very important is that even if you're looking at a PDF of a published paper, it is worth going back to PubMed, because they will tell you whether other people have written letters, comments in later issues, and whether the editorials on the article, because very clever minds might have put their mind to analyzing this paper in detail. And these editorial comments and letters on these published papers will often give you a deeper perspective before you change your practice based on that single PDF which is submitted to you. So it is worth looking for these by searching in PubMed. You will get under the article that letter published in this issue, they say letter published here, letter published there. So please look for these. So again, I would like to end this talk by the term EBM. So try and understand that we have understood what is high quality research. We are looking for data which is telling me an odds ratio, a relative risk, a mathematical estimate, or whether there's harm or benefit. This has come from a certain population which I have to match to my population to see whether it really suits me and the people I'm treating. And using all this is not simple mathematics, but I'm using my judgment, my intelligence, my clinical decision-making skill to apply all this information I have gained with my thought process to treat the individual who's in front of me in the OPD by all this information that I've gathered from my published paper. So I'll end at this point, and if there is any questions or discussion, I'm more than happy to participate in that. So over to you, Jignesh and Rakesh.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sudeep. That was fantastic, and absolutely I'm speechless. You've given a beautiful overview. Dr. Pawan, sir, do you want to start off with any questions or comments?
No, I think I must congratulate Dr. Sudeep for an excellent presentation, and it was absolutely absorbing for me and very informative as well. And I think he has touched upon each and every point that was that requires attention of residents and doctors when they are evaluating a published paper. So I would really congratulate him for making such an exhaustive and yet a very precise presentation, discussing all the nuances of the published papers. So many congratulations, Dr. Shah.
Thank you. Very kind.
Sudeep, I have one question before I put it on to Dr. Rajesh. Is the impact factor of the journal, would tell you that, okay, probably all the articles in this particular journal, because the impact factor is very good, is going to be the gospel truth. So
Right.
does that affect it? Yeah.
I would like to put it the other way around, that if it is an established journal with a low impact factor, the article is likely to be of poorer quality or more methodological flaws. But just because it is in a very high impact factor, very famous journal. So the Rofecoxib study where Merck lost billions of dollars was actually published in the NEJM. So it's not that just because it's in a good journal, we stop being critical. But what a good journal will do is will make sure all the facts are put before you. They'll have a statistical reviewer. Everything will be correctly put forward. So if you are a detective, you know what to look for. You are much more likely to find relevant information in a well-written article in a high impact factor journal than in a low impact factor journal where the editors may not take the effort or the trouble and the authors may not take the effort and the trouble to make sure that the paper is perfectly presented. So it's easier to gloss over flaws in a lower impact journal than in a higher impact journal. That is all I would like to say.
Okay. There's a question from Dr. Nishit Patel, and he's saying that suppose if he has a surgical clinical problem to be addressed, how should he go about finding out that which paper will answer his question well?
Right.
I will add to it, sir. I will add to it. Sir, excellent presentation, sir. We are delighted.
Thank
My
you.
question is, more than 75% of surgeons of this country, might be my assumption may be wrong. They are not regular reader of research paper, right?
Yeah.
And when they will find a paper when there is some confusion. Say, for example, I have a patient who has a ventral hernia centimeter. So when you go to papers, there are a group of surgeons, you said bias, it is very true. Somebody will say ETEP, somebody will say IPOM, somebody will say TRM, like that. So in those situations, when to find a right paper?
Right. So,
and yes, right answer.
So what I would do in this situation is there is a fantastic device, which is the smartphone, right? So you Google the question you are interested in. Now, we are not like our patients who are because we have a critical background, critical information about what we are looking at. And you will find a fair number of papers coming in. Often you will also find society guidelines which have quoted certain papers. Now, once you find papers, you will find papers which are pro and which are con. You just read the ones which are pro, you read the ones which are con. You will always find that every argument has two sides.
True.
Then you see in your practice which side is more convincing, less convincing. So you might find that you're tilted to one method by finances. You might be tilted to another method by technology available to you. You might be tilted to a third method by how sick the patient is. You may not want to put the patient under full GA. So looking at these factors and the papers that you have read, you have to take your decision for that individual patient in front of you. So we have the ability to search. We just need to spend a little bit of time. And I also find there's an app called Up to Date. A lot of you may be familiar with that. And there are many similar apps which are available. That will give me an overview with references which I can actually tap. And if I want to look deeper into any point, I can open these references and look at them. A PubMed search will help you find out all these papers. You just have to spend a little bit of time. Today, if you're doing this for the first time, you might find that it takes you 2 hours to find out relevant papers. But with practice, you'll find out in 10 minutes, you'll be able to pick out the 3 best papers very quickly and very easily. So if you don't start now, you'll never be able to do it. You start now, in 5 years, you'll be a master.
And again, another question. Yeah, yes, Rajesh.
No, my again question is on behalf of a general surgeon.
Yes.
Reading just an abstract and conclusion is sufficient, or we should go to the complete paper?
Right. So what I've shown you is all the flaws that you're looking at will always be in the text. See, the abstract is like a photo which is put up on a marriage website, right? So with all the makeup and the best angle, you put a snapshot. So before marrying someone, you have to meet the bride or groom.
True.
Sudeep, one more question is, you talked about a good paper and a bad paper. How much role does the editorial team play into this to, kind of scan it out? So is there something known as an editorial
that's
team
a very
bias?
interesting question. So I think some of us have been involved with journals in editorial roles, right?
Yes.
So obviously, if the data is completely dishonest, totally incredible, no editor will take it up. The next level is that you would want, as an Indian editor, to have Indian data coming forward. You might know some of the authors and might be a little more biased to publications, even in the biggest journals. So if you find out that there is a leading international center with an average quality paper, because there's a big name as first author, they will look more favorably towards that. So all these factors do come in. And ultimately, there's so many journals online, some paid, some unpaid. A lot of them are hunting for articles, and you just have to pay them $100, $500, and you will get published. So the editor has to fill up his journal with reasonable quality material, which is locally relevant to his leadership. And a good editor will try and do it in the best possible way without finding out at the end of 6 months that he's got an empty journal and no articles to publish.
Rajesh bhai, there's a question by Dr. Nishit. Can you just address that to Dr. Sudeep?
Dr. Nishit is asking, does most cited is most important?
Not really, because see, what are the most cited papers? So there is a paper which says that worldwide 250 million people suffer from hepatitis B. Now, any article in the world which on hepatitis B starts with that. So that a paper published in 1980 has been cited millions of times. But what is the relevance of that data is not relevant. You don't care, I don't care. Similarly, SARS-CoV virus was first identified in some publication somewhere in China. Every article published on SARS-CoV in the last year, that'll be the most cited article of last year. Now, where the first COVID virus was first identified in China, what is the relevance to us? So the reason they're quoted is because the introduction starts with that. So that number of citations really doesn't matter. It's the message in the article which is much more important.
We have some more members on the group. Yeah, yes, please. Rajesh bhai, please.
No, please.
So there's one more question. That how do you identify an original research? How do you, is there any checklist?
Right.
Which you run through in your clinical practice?
So see, all research is original because it's been done in a different environment. It's obviously not the same patients rehashed over and over again, hopefully. That only happens in thesis. So original research you will find in the so what, who cares method in the introduction. So clearly they will say that this is the lacuna in clinical knowledge, which is why I'm doing this paper. It might be a very small thing. Often Indians duplicate research done in Western countries and say that there is no data from India on this. Then they will say there's no data in Western India. Then they'll say there's no data in Mumbai. Then they will say there's no data in Parel. So whatever it is, they will try and justify the uniqueness of that. You can read that and then decide how original the article is.
Harsh, you have a question. Please go ahead, Harsh.
So my question to you is, would you place more emphasis on local over non-local research papers to guide your practice?
So that is a very, very important question. It is equally important for us to play local versus non-local research. We know very clearly that our patients are different from Westerners, right? So having gone from KEM to the UK for my training, right? The first time I opened an abdomen there, I was astonished by the length of time it took me to open and close an abdomen. Their build is entirely and completely different. So I'm sure that the hernia repair that you might be doing or abdominal wall reconstruction you're doing here will be equally different from what they might be doing there. A lot of benefits and complications of laparoscopic surgery will be different, because in India, you will have a 40 kilogram patient where you can take a 5 centimeter incision or 6 centimeter incision, which is the specimen size removal, and do a mini laparotomy for there and finish it off. While in the UK, if you're dealing with the standard 90 kilogram BMI 35 person, you will have to take a 25 centimeter incision to do the same surgery. So clearly your own data matters. We tolerate drugs to a different extent. Hospital stay means very different things in the US and India because of the finances involved. So this whole focus on getting people out of hospital fast is certainly not relevant to our practice as it is relevant to US insurance-based practice. So all these factors color the conclusions and the weightages of importance given to various things in publications. So we must always look at our data. And one great thing about India is that innovations are big in India, because we have to use the harmonic scalpel 100 times. We have to find different ways to suspend things. We have to look for the 20 rupee solution rather than the disposable $500 solution. So a lot of Indian literature focuses on innovations. And I would encourage all the seniors who are listening to this is please publish in Indian Journal. So I also make it a policy that I publish in the Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, Indian Journal of Surgery, because I believe that if you are doing work here relevant to Indian diseases on Indian patients, Indian readership should have the ability to read that, because they are going to actually get a message from it. So it is both the author as well as the reader who should emphasis on the Indian literature.
Great. That was a great tip. One more question from Nishit. Which paper, at the look or the face value of it, you will just trash it? Because I know that you're quite brutal at that sometimes.
No. So sometimes things are incredible, right? So if something is incredible, I would rather see a second paper. The second thing I would trash is that when you say that there were, we studied 20 patients and there were 12 males and 12 females. So then you know that if they cannot even add 12 plus 12 together and they're making 20, then the rest of the data goes out of the window. And all of us on the editorial side have faced such papers.
Correct.
So these papers immediately go out of the window. Then there's sometimes we know the center and the author, and then they will say we have done this quantity of work in the last 4 months. Now the technique has been introduced 4 months back, and suddenly 120 patient experience has been generated. So we are aware of what is happening. We may not want to pay too much attention to that. So immediately all these papers go. But when you look at the abstract, you look at the introduction, you look at the author, you'll have a fair idea whether you want to read it further. No complications. That always worries me. Surgical papers where no one has a complication, that petrifies me. I'm in awe of these.
Correct. Right. So we have few more, AWR members. Dr. Rahul, you want to have any comment or any questions? Dr. Rahul Madhav.
Hello.
We have
it was an excellent presentation. It was an excellent presentation, Dr. Shah, and you have made it very crisp and precise to what to look for and what not to look for. And that is where we Indian surgeons, rather, I can say, that is most important thing. And it is phenomenal. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So since we will not have, do we have any more questions? Otherwise, Dr. Rajesh, you can give up, sum up the things, then I'll sum up, and then probably Dr. Pawan, and then last we will tell Sudeep to give a take-home message. Yes, Dr. Rajesh.
No, it was really an excellent presentation, and I learned a lot because, as I said, probably I being that 75%, we don't regularly read and assess paper, but really it was a great talk and great learning. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
So what we saw today from this talk, just to summarize, is a beautiful way in which you select between a good paper and a bad paper. A very valid point, brought out by Harsh and added up by Dr. Sudeep, that We should look into more of local research because it's for our own population. And a take-home message also for the senior faculty that we should have more of publication in Indian journals compared to what we get obsessed or biased with publishing in the foreign articles. So wonderful, beautiful presentation, Dr. Sudeep. I'm sure this is going to be, archived, and each one of us is going to, look at it again and again. Pawan Indra, sir, your closing comments. I think Pawan sir is probably not in the group. So, Harsh, do you want to say, give a vote of thanks? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sudeep Shah, for this excellent talk. I think this is something that most of us lack in our clinical practice, and this is something that, I think will inspire a lot of us who've attended today to start assessing scientific papers critically and try to understand and analyze data. And that subsequently will help us publish even better quality papers in future. So great thank you to you, sir, for this excellent talk. And thank you, Dr. Jignesh Gandhi, Dr. Rajesh Srivastava for moderating this excellent session with equal excellence, and Dr. Pavendra Lal for his opening remarks. And I hope the next session is going to build up on this.
Yes, Sudeep, your take-home message for all of us.
Yeah, so it's a very simple take-home message. Please read and please write.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great.
So that summarizes our session today on the Smart Series Talk Season 2. Thanks for your valuable time, and we'll see you soon the coming week with another interesting topic. So take care, everybody. Be safe. Thank you to all of you. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Thanks very much for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you.